You're listening to Culture Champions, a podcast about what it takes to cultivate exemplary work cultures and master sustainable business growth. In each episode, host Zain Hasan sits down with business leaders and experts to bring you in-depth conversations on maximizing value and success in all aspects of your company.
Unbelievably excited about today's conversation. And today we've got Scott Carter, who I've had the fortune and pleasure of getting to know pretty well. But Scott, for our audience, if you don't mind, I think it'd be great if you could give us a 60-second intro and background. It doesn't have to be 60 seconds, but just to give an overview on who you are.
Zain, thanks for having me today. It's always good spending time with you. I feel very fortunate to be with you today. So by way of background, I started in the restaurant business as a kid. My dad had me in there at 5 a.m. Every Saturday and Sunday. And I did that all growing up. You know, we called it slinging hash, scooping ice cream, and really rolling up our sleeves and doing whatever it took to make sure everyone was well fed. So I did that for a whole bunch of years. And I always like to start with that because I learned so much in the restaurant business that I feel like I still apply today. Then, going to school, and I learned a lot in school. I don't know that my grades would reflect it. So I wasn't getting a lot of calls coming out of college. But I did get one, and that's all I needed. So I started off in the benefits industry and joined a great group of people, but my mentor in particular. And we were a benefits brokerage, and when I was employee number 5, did that, learned how to serve clients and learned a set of values there. And the name of that company was FST Associates. And then I joined a company by the name of Laura Strategies. That was a very small company and held a leadership position there and helped scale that company before doing it a third time, a company called Laura Strategies, benefits, property casualty, HR, all in Chicago, and scaled that business before we exited. And then decided to do it again in the PEO industry. PEO is professional employer organization. It's basically HR outsourcing for small companies. Took over 2 entrepreneurial companies there, merged them together and scaled it before exiting again. Before most recently, I have the good fortune of joining a holding company.
So there's, even in just your background, you just mentioned a number of things, like you can both small organizations and scaled it. And so that just, and what I know about you is you're someone who is a true culture champion. You really protect the culture that you built as you've done that both at Loris. I think the one question before even getting the details are, can you talk about what magnitude you scaled it? Like when it started, how many employees versus, the exit, both at Loris and then it sounds like at Empower?
Yeah, Laura Strategies in particular, when we were involved, we were about 23 employees. And then when we sold it, we were a couple hundred. And then at Empower HR, we were about 40 employees. And when we sold it, we're about 130.
And that's all, other than the beginning with Empower, that's all organic, right? That's all true organic hiring.
Yep, all organic. I learned early on, and it was tough, to be honest. When I led these organizations or was in a position of leadership, I wanted to be good at everything. And I had a lot of insecurities I was dealing with. I remember butting heads with some of, my business partners who were awesome at sales. And the irony in that was when I was looking for business partners, I was looking for people who could complement me. So I considered myself a culture champion and really focused on service excellence, client service. But I also wanted to be this organic growth, like awesome sales guy too. So despite seeking out partners when they came on board, like my ego was getting in the way. I almost remember to the day at Laura Strategies when the light bulb went off, saying, you know what? I'm fortunate to be partnering with guys and people who are great at something that's different than I am. And the sooner I can get over my insecurities and just embrace, what I'm great at, the better off we'll be. And there was a cultural element going on underneath the surface there that I wasn't even aware of. But I realized that we had a room that was safe. And once I realized we had safety, all the insecurities or how I worked through my insecurities changed. So I think it's just safety is key. So I digress a little bit there, but
no, that was actually a beautiful digression because there was so much wisdom in what you just described. So you talked about the insecurities you had, and as you're scaling and as CEO, when you think about leadership, it's that there are so many different challenges, right? That any leader deals with. It sounds like at Loris, the culture, it was a byproduct, but maybe not as intentional. And then Empower was very, very intentional around culture.
Yeah, I don't know exactly when the transition happened. I think it was I would say it happened at Loris, but let's call it in the second half of the game. The first half was, all right, we're all here. We're trying to serve clients and attract talent. And, we were running. So I think we had some core values underneath the surface that were attractive, but they weren't words. It was a way of life. And it was being authentic, but there were no words, and I think, especially at Empower, changing culture meant changing the conversation, and changing the conversation meant that we had to have new words. Once we had the words, when I talk to people about it, I'm like, pretend you're like memorizing lines to play a role in a movie. You memorize them first, so you can all speak consistent language. And then once you memorize them, you can actually feel them. And once you feel them, you can live them, and you can be them, and you can do them. In the early days of Loris, we were doing these things, and thankfully we were fairly consistent. But as we scaled and as we grew, it wasn't enough. We needed the words. We needed to change the conversation. We needed to change the words, memorize the lines, and then feel them.
That level of clarity that you have around what needed to happen. And like, as I guess a lot of that might be hindsight, but how do you have that? Were you beginning Empower? Were you thinking like, I'm going to build a great culture, or like, where did culture fit into the concept of in any role you played? Was that at what point did you were like, culture is number one, or was it, no, let's get the business running and then culture? Like, I'm just trying to understand, how did you learn? Because there's so much to learn in the process of trying to, maintain and be a culture champion. I'm just trying to understand how you learn that.
It's interesting. And I think the way I'd say it is it came with a lot of introspection. And the reason I say that is, when I was a kid, and I actually got made fun of at times, if I cried publicly for losing a game, or maybe a teacher yelled at me, I'd feel my eyes water up, and I'm like, oh gosh, don't cry. And then a tear would fall, and like my buddy's like, you crying? And the reason I talk about that, Zain, I'm getting PTSD just talking about it. Oh my gosh. The cafeteria one day, like I started crying because the teacher yelled at me. The sensitivity, I was always a sensitive kid and a sensitive guy. Took a little bit of a ribbon as a youngster. I think it helped me as I grew older. When I was looking for a job, and I mentioned my grades weren't terrific in college, my mentor, his name was Bill. When Bill hired me, he said, hey, I know a couple things about you. One, you're a very likable guy and you can relate to people. We're in the service business, and that's worth a lot. And the second thing is, you grind. What your dad put you through in the restaurant, I know you will grind. So if I have those two things, you're good. I started to appreciate like how my mentor at the time defined culture in his head. I mean, those were essentially, he could turn those into core values. Again, we didn't have words at that time, but I was feeling, okay, I see what he values. So then you take that, fast forward it, we grew, I grew in my career. I was always really sensitive to the energy in a room, and then the energy one-on-one. And quite honestly, that's what attracted me to you. Beyond, I think you have great hair, but beyond your hair, when I first met you, I mean, you think about, it's funny, Zain, like I got to know you really well, and I never met you in person. But what I valued is the energy I felt coming from you, that you really cared about me and you really cared about the interaction we were having. And so there's this power of moments. And because I was such a sensitive kid, and I still consider myself a sensitive guy today, I realized that chemistry and the energy that we create as humans ultimately is like fundamentally about culture. Culture is like a set of organic relationships and interactions that's constantly happening. I would be in rooms at Lower Strategies or Empower, and I'd walk through the office, and I'm such an idealist. I'd want everyone to be like, hey, Scott, how you doing? Everyone's so happy. We're serving clients, we're selling insurance, we're doing HR. Like, it's awesome. And certain days I'd look around and I'm like, I'm not feeling it. And then my insecurities would kick in, and I'd be like, what am I doing wrong? I suck. And what I realized is, well, that's good. So I should be grateful that I'm noticing and I care, but how do I fix it? And, at the time I wasn't a big reader, but I think I did I'll give myself some credit. Like I wasn't even calling it culture, but I recognize that there's this important energy that should exist within our businesses and within our tribe, to steal a word from you, within our tribe, that if we can take, and I think of like two components, if we can take what I call now the authentic connections that we develop as humans and match it up with a common purpose, we could create magic. And that excited me. And I don't know if
that's amazing. Just what you
simplify it, right? Two things. How do we establish authentic connections, which is like vulnerability, safety, personal risk, emotional risk, and then match it up with like a shared goal, common purpose? We can do anything. Actually, it doesn't really matter what we do. In my world, it doesn't matter what we do. So when I called you, I'm like, what do you want? You want to do refrigerators? I like refrigerators. We can brighten people's day if we can give them good food out of refrigerator, whatever you want to do, as long as we share the passion around those two things.
That energy, before it became, words that were defined and a purpose that was defined, it was the energy that you were really emphasizing. But like just even in hearing, the concept of if you describing yourself as sensitive when you're young, but knowing when people ask, like me, and they're asking about what's it like to be the CEO of the organization, there's no way for me to really articulate because every day is different. Everything is, it changes in terms of, and unfortunately, there are challenges, right? There are times where, especially if you're from a sensitivity level, I think that helps because you can be really empathetic to the other person. But there are times where you have to demote people that are in significant roles. There are times where people can't continue to go with you, and just challenges that like beyond what I could possibly articulate in any podcast, what it's like every day to try to make sure that we can champion the culture. And some of those are just direct, but it's just hard to do because we care about other people. So how did you manage as you go through that? And sometimes you do have to let people go that you care about deeply, that represent the right culture, but maybe they don't, there's the circumstances of where the business needs to go and what they bring doesn't correlate anymore. I mean, how did you manage that internal, sensitivity, but be able to come to the conclusion of being able to decide whether to let someone go or demote them or make the hard business decision that you had to make?
How did I do it? Early on, I didn't do it well. And I did end up going to business school. And, I don't know about you, but I'd read things like the biggest mistake people made in business is not making the tough decisions soon enough. It's like as a parent, people would say it goes by fast. It's said so often, you almost become tone deaf to that comment. But that comment, I think, has a lot of validity in terms of making the tough decisions sooner, especially when it comes to people. I forever will remember my first tough decision I had to make on a person. And she was well liked by many, like the cool kid, but I saw the silent impact she was having by how she treated people who she didn't think were the cool kids. After multiple conversations and me listening and understanding my role in that, not a bad person, but I have to protect the tribe and I got to make the tough decision on one to protect the many. I realized that there's a lot of eyes on us as leaders, CEO, whatever. As a leader, everyone's watching, and it's almost fraudulent if we're not living our core values and our commitments consistently. When I think someone used that word on me, I don't remember who, but that word feels bad, right? Fraudulent.
Right. Yeah.
You're a fraud. You're not living your pillars. I'm like, whoa, how dare you? Right. So that's thing. So I think it's just remembering for the greater good, we have to make the tough decisions, but it is hard. And we're actually doing it because we care. And actually an old business partner by the name of Dan used to say to me, never stop caring. If you stop caring, it's time for us to hang it up because we're losing our soul. So it is hard. It'll always be hard. When I have to do it again the next time, it's going to be hard. And quietly, I might even cry. But but yeah, to protect the tribe and to protect the culture, there will be tough decisions. I struggle with them today, Zain, like looking back and I'm in a new chapter now. And I look back on relationships and I sometimes wonder, should I go back in on this one? I still think about it. It feels like unfinished business. But I don't have it resolved in my head sitting here, quite honestly.
I can respect that more tremendously because there are so many things. And I think about looking back before I was a culture champion, because, quite honestly, at the beginning of my entrepreneurial process, I was not as intentional on culture as I am today. And so it's like, looking back, and part of it was even making amends with people who I didn't treat well, that I knew I didn't. And just to make sure that regardless of whether they'd forgive me, that I wanted them to know I was apologetic for how I acted at that time. But you mentioned some things about like the fact that, as a leader.
Can I interrupt you just for a second? Because I think that says a lot about you, that you care enough to go back in and just let them know that you care, because you can't control how they respond, but you can control what you do. And I think that's just an important lesson for all of us because it happens. And I'm not perfect I don't do this perfectly. Today, I don't do it, but I'm committed to getting better. I could have an interaction yesterday, and I did, by the way, and that I was like, that wasn't great. I should remember listening to your story. I should remember I should go back in today and just say, hey, listen, that wasn't great. I'm better than that. And I care about you. Because I think when you were talking about that story about how you've gone back, it just triggered in me that it's important to do, even on a daily basis.
I mean, I think that the concept and what I just learned out of the process is that for you, a big part was what Dan said, and that, if you ever stop caring, you should hang it up. And if I understand that correctly, it means if you ever stop caring about the people, right? We're talking about the people, not what the business per se does, but the people.
Yeah. Thanks for that important distinction. The people.
So I guess now when I think about the fact that you've done this multiple times, and regardless of how much, we're always going to be our own biggest critic. So as much as you criticize your own history and things you've done from the external, you've done amazing things. You've scaled amazing organizations. And I've seen the level of depth and commitment that almost every single person had to the organization that you and your leadership team and your entire team built. And it was like, it wasn't just a tribe. It was a tribe, a community. It was like, I think your personal purpose. What is your personal purpose? I think the audience it'd be great for them to hear that.
To create a movement of authentic connections that lead to mind-blowing experiences and better versions of ourselves.
And the movement was the word that was on the tip of my tongue. It was a movement. You had created a movement with the team, and I noticed it. I could feel the vibe. So when I think about, like, we could always do a lot of things better, but you did a lot really, really, really well. And so at the end of the day, when I think about that concept of how you did that so well, as it relates to every person you bring on from the leadership team, how did you think about, like, okay, what's going to be the criteria of who I will select for my partners or the people that join the leadership team?
Yeah, that's a great question too. Well, I mean, you said vibe. My kids say that too. Good vibes, energy. So I am cognizant of energy. And so when I meet with people, a coach I work with, again, dear friend, Rich, he said, when you're in touch with your core, trust your intuition around energy. I have spent a lot of time on my values, and therefore I trust my intuition when I'm feeling good energy. So that's number one, feel the energy. And when we have good energy, and I feel this with you, I believe you and I share oxygen in the room pretty equally. Every once in a while I'm like, oh my God, did I just throw up on Zain, and talk too much? I think that's an important thing to be aware of and something I've been aware of. So when I'm looking for a team to surround myself with, energy is number one. Number two is conversation. Are we sharing the oxygen in the room? And it's a simple symptom of them saying, I'm interested in you and I care about you. And I'm saying the same to them versus, again, it's not bad, just might not be a good fit for me, is someone who's taken all the oxygen out of the room, because I interpret that as they care more about them than they do me, or more importantly, what we're trying to accomplish together. So that's the second thing. Third, and I know we share this in common, just people who have a servant leadership, but a servant heart. Like they're committed to being in service of others, and the words they use, the experiences they talk about, but people who are driven by being in service of others, I find is attractive, because as a leadership team, now translate that to a leadership team, it's a burden, it's an obligation, it's a lot. Quite honestly, whatever word you want to put to it, it's a lot to handle. And there's going to be days that aren't so good. You wake up in the morning and whatever, you're not feeling it. Maybe your kids are cranky, you stepped in the dog do, whatever it is, and you got to go and show up at work and make it about everybody else. And so that's a unique person. And I'd say just the last thing, I like to have fun. Entrepreneurs, they sign up for hard. So let's have fun. And so you don't think you're funny. I think you're really funny. But I like to be around people who make me laugh. And that doesn't mean like they're a comedian. And we do have some on our team, as you know, but also it's just we can laugh.
Just not take yourself so seriously, right? Like
that's the
just
best.
look at opportunities to try to bring levity to whatever serious situation it is, just because it's like, man, things can get so serious that it's like, wait, I mean, in a month, we probably won't even remember the dialogue. So why don't we inject some levity into the conversation too?
Right. And if you think about that, bring that full circle to energy, who do you want to be around?
I mean, you just
be around
described
people
it.
who make you feel good,
Yeah.
Those are just some of the things when I think about, there's others too, in terms of like core value, like grit and perseverance. And because we do get punched in the face, not literally, but figuratively.
Especially if we have a plan.
Right. I heard
Meaning
that.
everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yeah. Mike Tyson.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, those are all important. And that's where we need a team, though, to help lift one another up when that does happen.
So one of the things you mentioned, and you said you're, through your coach, and how the depth of how in touch you are with your core and the movement of authentic connections that you wanted to create, the thinking, I call it thinking time, taking the time to think about life and to critically think about whether it's not being in the business or even being on the business, but looking at the business like it's a machine, right? And looking at life like it's, because we control whatever the next thing is we do. Whatever we did, the last thing we did, we can't change because we just did it, but we can control the very next thing we do. And we have that ability to do that at any given moment, no matter what happened 1 second ago. Right. So when I think about the concept of the thinking time, it's rare that I get the opportunity to meet people that can clearly articulate a personal purpose, that can clearly articulate personal core values. And a lot of that is more of like, even to articulate it in a room, you got to go back and test it and see if what you think you developed is really the right set of core values. One of the things that I've noticed in business and the more people I've met is that the more time that they've spent genuinely thinking, like it's a Bill Gates thing. I know he spends some time, like I think annually, where he goes and just literally thinks like for a couple of days. And I think like I studied in one of Jeff Bezos' books or about him, it's like 1 day a week he doesn't do any business decisions, he just thinks. And so when I think about that concept of how much time you spent thinking about to get clarity, and the coach that you did it, I mean, is that a practice and a routine you developed to do that? Because that's a rare thing.
Practice and habits. Well, actually, where it all started, you and I both belong to YPO. It started in YPO, my forum, which I don't know if everyone knows what a forum is, but ours is a group of 8 guys now, but it was 6. And we are like a support group, but dear friends. And as we go through life together, in business and in life, I should say, we know we have a confidential group of people who's committed to constant pursuit of better. So at any rate, we were on a retreat and we were kayaking down. We launched out of the Hoover Dam. And by the way, something I learned about the Hoover Dam, it's the second most secure structure in the United States, next to the White House. Not sure if that's...
I had no idea. That's remarkable.
Crazy, right? You want to know how we learned that?
How?
One of the guys on our trip, there wasn't a good bathroom facility there, so he chose to pee in the river, and all these security guards came out of nowhere and said that was on it. You have to keep your clothes on in that area, and they were going to give him a ticket, but anyway, it ended up.
And that could happen. That could happen to any of us. I mean, that has happened. I mean, not the Hoover Dam per se, but I mean. The part about where the police can come up and that could happen anyway. You said we're all human.
Right. Especially if you're out in nature, it's natural to pee outside. I think for some, I do enjoy that. But anyway, so we're going down the river, and we had a mediator with us, and he did this super cool exercise, and it was called, and I'm simplifying it, but he put us into partners. So I had a partner, my friend Amish, and we went, scurried up this hill, in the canyons down there, and it was finish the statement. My life feels ideal when, and then we just started talking. And Amish would ask me questions and I would talk and he would write. And then literally, I think it was 2 hours, he then identified themes in what I was saying. And one of the themes was, my life feels ideal when I am clearing my head in the outdoors. It sounds so simple, but I'd never stopped to be able to articulate that.
Right.
Like, my life feels ideal because I'm at peace, because I have clarity, because I'm able to work through things. I'm able to be retrospective or introspective, and I do it best being outside. So then that should become a habit. I should make that a priority because my life feels ideal when I do that. And I think I feel like I'm a better human after I do it. So then it becomes a habit. How do you work that into your daily life? And so that brings me back to my coach. He helped teach me practices and techniques, knowing that my life feels ideal when I'm clearing my head outdoors, that could take it to the next level. So some of my practices are just breath work and practicing breath work, some of the Wim Hof stuff, box breathing. But probably the coolest and most mind-blowing experience that turned into a movement was I started a cold plunging community.
And what's that? Just both for me and not, I mean, I've heard it, but for
Oh
the
yeah,
audience mainly.
yeah, for sure. It's more difficult to do it in South Florida. In the Chicagoland area, Lake Michigan, beginning in November, probably. Lake Michigan gets into like the 40-degree temp. And then by January and February, Lake Michigan is well into the 30s and oftentimes has a thin layer of ice on it. So we immerse ourselves in the icy cold waters of Lake Michigan, and we practice breath work to regulate our body temperature, where we can sit in it for, extended periods of time.
Wow. You're talking about like, you essentially jump in like an ice bath, or like it's like a glacier. You're like jumping in a glacier in the morning and you're like practicing breath work. Like,
yeah, no, you did that really well. Yeah. 4 in, 4 out. Yeah, perfect.
That's remarkable.
It was cool, Zain. More than cool. It was transformational for me to do it myself. But the bigger win in it was we've had over 200 people in my community who have participated in this cold water immersion, and easily 7 days a week now there are people down there doing it. This is bigger than me. I don't take any credit other than maybe being one of the initial crazy people in that area to do it. People have been doing this around the world for 100 years. My friend Rich just said, hey, this is what you should do, because I skipped this part and I don't want to take up too much time, but I was in an emotional rut at that time. I was actually depressed. I couldn't figure out what to do. And he's like, try this. Your life feels ideal when you're clearing your head outdoors. Let's go sit in Lake Michigan in the freezing cold water. And I was like, well, that sounds pretty freaking crazy, but I'll give it a try.
That's amazing. That story is amazing. And in service of others, because the way you just described it, one of the things you emphasized early, and one of the things that I look at whenever I'm talking to someone, is how much they emphasize the team and the people that they serve versus what the word I. Right. So, which you've done consistently throughout every part of this dialogue and ever since I've known you. So I think the in every way, this dialogue has been one that I believe the audience is going to get a lot of value out of. And so in service to our audience, I think I'm glad we came together on this. So one of the final questions that I ask everybody is, if you had the opportunity to go back and talk to, Scott at 22, what lessons would you try to teach Scott so that, based on what you've learned today, so that you could, prepare a younger Scott for success? And this doesn't just mean Scott, right? This would be advice for anybody, but it's really based on what you've learned about yourself and things that you feel like would be great lessons to have learned earlier.
I thought you were friends and you were going to give me all the questions in advance. This one you didn't tell me.
I didn't.
You kept this one in the back pocket. I forgive you. So here's what I'd say, looking back, and I actually feel emotion as I'm saying this. I had immense insecurities that held me back. So if you've ever heard someone ask the question, either of yourself or somebody else, like, what's holding you back? To me, I had just a lot of insecurities that caused me to not place big enough bets. And I'm not talking about financial bets. I'm talking about emotional, professional. I was fearful of failure. So that's probably number one. Like, work through insecurities. We all have them. I still have them today. I think I mentioned that earlier, but work through them. And I think the best way to work through them is vulnerability. I did surround myself with great people who created a safe environment. It was my choice not to be vulnerable enough because I had these insecurities. Now, if the advice to somebody else is, make sure that you surround yourself with people who create a safe environment and encourage vulnerability. We're doing things together as a family, as a tribe. That's the fun part. And how do you feel when you're vulnerable And how did that work for you? How long did it take for you to be comfortable in your own skin and to be vulnerable? Did that come naturally to you?
No, not at all. And that's a great question. I think, like we mentioned earlier, and you mentioned YPO, I think YPO has been, which YPO, for the audience who may not be aware at all, YPO stands for Young Presidents Organization. And the concept behind YPO is theoretically it's you're in, there's some qualifications about, in order to get in, but it's you're the president or the leader of a company that has certain qualifications, and then it's a peer-to-peer ability to really, and completely confidential, where nothing is ever shared. So in a non-competitive environment, I think YPO helped me a lot with that. I struggle with that, the vulnerability, still today. I think I'm very vulnerable when it comes to in the organization, in RTA today. I believe I'm very vulnerable, and I lead with vulnerability, because it to me, it's one of those things where it's like, at the end of the day, I know there are areas that I'm extremely weak. But what you mentioned about the concept of, am I comfortable in my own skin? Every day, I actually think, and I'll be very vulnerable right now, I start thinking about, am I actually going to be able to do this long term? Am I going to be able to build what I want to build? And a big part of why this show even exists is because I'm trying to get insights from those who've done it, and make sure that I can avoid the landmines or have better guidance through the process, because I'm so curious about how people built the culture and tribes that they did at scale, that I want to make sure that I can take those lessons. And I figured that an audience would hopefully want to learn the same thing too. But as it relates to being comfortable in my own skin, it depends on the day. I mean, it depends on what happened that morning at home. It depends on whether my wife and I interacted well, if I was, a good dad to my kids in the morning, or if I didn't even get to see them. And that changes how I show up in that moment, and then how I feel about myself. And then, do I look the part? Do I feel like I'm the part? I mean, every conversation I have with somebody, I'm criticizing myself, silently, about how that could have gone so much better. So I think that maybe there's no such thing as true comfort in your own skin. I'm definitely comfortable being vulnerable and leading vulnerably, but I'm not anywhere near at the point of saying like, oh, I'm confident that this is going to be a path or a journey that won't be hard. I think it's going to be really hard, but it's going to be really rewarding. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And what I've noticed is you're really present, not just present with the interaction, but you're present with what's going on within yourself, because you oftentimes articulate it. So I think you have continuous vulnerability by just being present. For that reason, I bet on you, man. I'm in.
Really appreciate it. I think this was in one of the best, if not probably the best, actual dialogue we've had. A lot of insights gleaned. And so for the audience, people who want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way? And what we'll do is we'll drop it down in the show notes afterwards. But how would you like people to get in touch with you if they have questions and want to learn more or want to reach out?
Probably email scott.carter@risktag.com. I'd love it, because I learned from those conversations too. It's something I think Zain and I share is a commitment to being curious, which is active listening, continuous learning. So the more authentic connections we can create, that movement will continue. So reach out, let's catch up. My only ask is show up and be vulnerable and authentic, and we'll make magic happen.
I love it, Scott. Thank you so much for joining the show. And I'm 100% confident I'm going to ask you back on down the road. So
thanks for having me. Looking forward to going on the journey together. We're going to have a good ride.
Sounds good.
Thank you for listening to the Culture Champions podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode. You'll find links to any resources mentioned in the show notes. If you're enjoying our show, be sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star review. And if you have someone you'd like to hear on the show, or a topic you'd like to see covered, please email pat.davisbryant@risktag.com.